Hi guys! As you may know, this year I'm attempting to read all of the books of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, and since I finished the first two, I thought I should do a review of them. They are The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic. They're the first two books published in the Discworld series, and they're also the first two books of the Rincewind sub-series. Rincewind is a wizard of sorts who was studying at the Unseen University, the College for Wizards. But what with one thing and another, he ended up learning one of the 8 great spells that hold the universe together. And since then, all the other spells have been afraid to share a head with one of the 8 great spells. So he can't actually learn any magic, so the whole being a wizard thing is kind of failing. And in these two books, he is escorting around the entirety of the Discworld Twoflower, who is the first tourist on the disc. And I gotta say, these are not my favorite Discworld books. The Color of Magic, I'm just gonna go ahead and say I don't like. As you get later in the Discworld series, it starts to be more social satire, but in these earlier books, it's more high fantasy and satire of other high fantasy. And particularly in this one, which was published in 1983, it has a very 80s feel. Lots of discussion of races and geography, and people who are wearing perhaps slightly less clothing than is advisable. And I'm pretty sure that he's doing it to poke fun at other books from the genre in the 80s, but it still doesn't quite work for me. You can really tell that The Color of Magic was the first book in a massive series. The portrayal of some of the characters hasn't quite settled into place. For example, Death and Lord Vetinari, who are some fan favorites, are portrayed almost like villains. They seem slightly more pleased to be malicious, whereas in later books they're more stoic intellectuals, Lord Vetinari in particular, who, while he is a tyrant, is a benevolent tyrant. But the main problem with The Color of Magic is that it does not have a plot. Rincewind and Twoflower get captured by like 4 or 5 different people, and then they have to execute elaborate escapes. But they're all individual episodes and aren't really building to a bigger story. But fortunately, it's a relatively short book. The two of these books together are only slightly longer than the length of Discworld novel he's writing now for the most part. And they're also the most tightly bound set of books in any of the sub-series. In most cases, there is an unspecified number of weeks or months that elapses between the end of one book and the start of another, but The Color of Magic ends literally on a cliffhanger, and yes, I am using the word literally correctly. And then The Light Fantastic picks up directly where The Color of Magic left off. So then we get into The Light Fantastic, which solves many of the problems that were in The Color of Magic. It was published 3 years later. That's like, I think, the longest interval between Discworld books. So Terry had quite a long time to think about it and plan things out. We don't see Lord Vetinari in this one, but we do see the character of Death, and he's slightly more fun and relatable, like he is later. Death. He's a great guy. And we also spend less time with Rincewind and Twoflower. Instead, like, the plot is happening over at the Unseen University, where a young upstart wizard is attempting to seize power. And the rest of the wizards kind of let themselves be led, since there is a giant red star that is getting bigger and bigger in the night sky, and maybe the world will end. That sometimes happens. And of course, Rincewind has to save the world, even though he's not a very good wizard at all. And the sort of final showdown was done in a way that was very typical of the earlier Discworld books, which involves our hero physically fighting with some monstrosity from like the dungeon dimensions, which is not my favorite way for them to end because these books are so witty and clever. I'd kind of like them to be solved through wit and cleverness as opposed to brute strength, particularly when our protagonists are like little old ladies or cowardly wizards. So taking all of that into consideration, The Light Fantastic is a fine book, whereas The Color of Magic was a bad book. However, there is one element that, for me, makes this into a good book, though not a great book, and that is the bromance. I love a good bromance, you guys. I may have cried at the end of the first Hobbit movie because he's like, we are friends now, and then they hug. Oh, guys! But anyway, There's not that much of that, so if you can't stand bromance, you should not use that as an excuse to not read The Light Fantastic. So final verdict, I gave The Color of Magic 2 stars, and I gave The Light Fantastic 3.5 stars. I had already read both of these several years ago, so I was just reading them for completion even though I knew that they weren't my favorite. And I'm probably not going to reread them a third time. There are Discworld novels that I would do that for, and have done that for, but not these early ones. Thanks for watching, guys. I will be back soon with more information on this complicated thing that is Discworld.